And with that, welcome inside this week opening edition of Big Ten Today. Rick Pizzo, thrilled to be joined by Anthony Herron. And Big Ant, I am generally not a fan of Mondays, but next Monday I'm okay with, because this is the final week that we have to start without the ability to look ahead to Big Ten football being played.
This is week 0. There was one time back in my Iowa days where we played. Week 0 wasn't really a term in the lexicon back then, but we did play in the Eddie Robinson Kickoff Classic back in my senior season. That was the only year where we played a 12-game schedule during my career. Now everyone's playing week 0, 12-game regular season, all this other stuff. But yes, this is the final week without a full slate of games upon us.
There's usually only a 1-week variance at the start of the year, but depending on what we decide to do with the college football playoff, who knows? We're now into late January, maybe into March, maybe competing with the NCAA basketball tournament. We go to 32 teams. Everybody wants to be part of the 12, and according to the AP preseason poll, the Big Ten has a legitimate chance to have multiple teams in this year's college football playoff. In fact, I think we'd all be surprised if there were not at least 2, maybe 3 Big Ten teams as part of this year's 12-team field. You see Ohio State and Oregon ranked 2nd and 3rd, respectively. Penn State and Michigan also inside the top 10. USC and Iowa part of the top 25 as well. So let's start with the conversation about the teams that have a realistic chance of being part of the first ever 12-team playoff. And I think you have to start in Columbus with Ohio State. They don't play a team in September with a winning record. Gets a lot tougher in October when you have to go to Eugene to take on Oregon. But Anthony, regardless of the schedule, it appears that Ohio State has all the pieces to make a run toward the national title.
And to be able to do it in a season with this expanded playoff where there is more margin for error than we're accustomed to for all these teams around the country. And so, we've seen of recent vintage where Ohio State has lost to Oregon early in the season, and then it's brought about a lot of questions about where the remainder of the season would go for the Buckeyes. That's not as much of a concern. It is going to be a huge game when the Bucks go and play the Ducks, but then after that, they still got the rest of conference play to go. So the story of the season won't be told just from any one individual contest because of the expanded playoff. But when you're talking national championship, it is going to be fun to watch 2 of the top teams in America do battle, and Ohio State, certainly one of the ones who is chief amongst that conversation.
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation with Ross Dellinger last week. He's like, everybody wants to be part of the top 4 because you get a first-round bye, but that means you don't get to play a playoff game in your home stadium. How cool would it be for Ohio State to have a home game inside the Horseshoe? There's a schedule that we referenced, but it's really not, I don't think, for this Ohio State team about who you're playing. It's about how you're playing, because when you are as loaded as Ohio State is, whether it's the running back room with Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson, the wide receivers with Ibuka and Carnell Tate, and a young man who I think everybody believes will come in and be an automatic impact player, and that defense that returns so many starters who could have been part of the NFL draft. Honestly and personally, I will be shocked if this team is not still playing in mid-January.
I agree. And all the roster additions you reference are huge. But then also you think about the fact they've added Chip Kelly to this coaching staff. That may be the biggest acquisition out of any that we're discussing in Columbus. And not just how it works out schematically for the Buckeyes, because Ryan Day, he's already been able to coach, to lead, to call plays for many of the top offenses in college football in the time that he's been in Columbus. But you think about some of the in-game moments, some of those 4th down decisions. Does he go for it or does he not? Which play ends up getting called? That's been as much of the scrutiny that's been there for Ryan Day and how he's managed.
He's had to deal with both those decisions.
Exactly. So now Chip Kelly's there and he can take some of that load off his plate. Not only the play that gets called, but with Ryan Day not having to call the play, he can maybe just make as informed a decision as he's been capable of making at any point that he's been here. That's what having Chip Kelly in there does. You don't only add one of the top offensive minds, but having a trusted play caller in there. Now that's where those moments in game are critical. So to be that CEO, Ryan Day should be able to handle those moments as well as he ever has.
Jim Knowles, the DC, says, I see your comment on the addition of Chip Kelly on the offensive side, and I raise you Caleb Downs in my secondary. That Ohio State back 4 is going to be absolutely nasty. And by the way, the front 7 is pretty good as well. They will get a big-time test on the road against Oregon. Oregon is a team that has done nothing but win under Dan Lanning, one of, if not the most impressive under 40-year-old coaches that I've ever met in my career covering college football, college sports in general. Oregon, certainly a team with Dylan Gabriel, with what they have in the backfield, with what they do defensively, that we also expect to be part of the playoff.
And I believe that when you look at the Ducks, the fact that they've won at a high level in the first couple of seasons Dan Lanning has been there, but they haven't been over that championship hump, then that should provide that locker room that additional bit of fuel where they can't feel like they're complacent. They can't feel too comfortable going into this year because not only are they joining a new league and a new conference, but there are still higher heights for them to climb. But there is this conversation around Oregon football that sort of has them, I guess, in some ways being viewed amongst the 1%ers of the sport as though they have won a championship in recent years. And, previous regime did do that, but Dan Lanning hasn't gotten that done yet in a couple of seasons in Eugene. So I do believe that'll be a part of the message to his players to recognize the opportunity is there, but they haven't gotten it done yet. That's where that extra little force and focus needs to come from for Oregon. And they've got all the tools. They've got all the pieces available to them. And you referenced certainly what's their quarterback, but playmakers around Dylan Gabriel will be a huge part of it as well.
I also think I love the way that their schedule does sit up. You kind of get, no offense to UCLA and Michigan State, but you get slightly warmed up in Big Ten play. Your first Big Ten game is not a long road trip. It's down to LA, and then Michigan State goes to Eugene. Ohio State goes to Eugene to start the year. So I know coaches don't necessarily like to look at a schedule and say, boy, this sets up really well for me. But Anthony, I got to tell you, this sets up really well for Oregon.
I think it sets up really well for the Ducks. I understand the points you're making. I'm picking up what you're putting down. And especially when you just think about what Autzen Stadium is. When you have big games
it's so
in Eugene, it's just a special place for college football. And there's going to be a lot of Big Ten fans who get the opportunity to get introduced to it on this network, on other networks, and certainly hoping that all the Big Ten fans will have the opportunity to travel out there as well because of what it represents. Not only to those Ducks fans, but they're one of the programs here that really in recent decades have come into the fore as one of the elite brands in the sport. But there's still a lot of the country that hasn't gotten to experience that. So I'm really excited to see what that represents, and especially with big games that are going to be there for a team in the championship conversation with a quarterback and with playmakers like Terrence Ferguson as a tight end. His stature, his size, his playmaking ability, he's all Pac-12. They've got several returning starters on the offensive line. So Dylan Gabriel is bolstered by experience and playmaking ability and other talent that have commanded the big stage for the Ducks before. There's a lot that coalesces for Oregon this season that feel like they're going to be on the cusp of something special.
And I think a huge edge for Oregon, much like for Ohio State. You have two guys in the backfield that can do it for Ohio State. You have two guys for Oregon. Jordan James jumps off the page, but Noah Whittington is a really talented back who got hurt early last year. Otherwise, I think they would have shared a lot more carries, and I think Dan Lanning has the ability to do that. And speaking of teams with a two-headed running back monster, we also have to discuss Penn State. I've said many times, and I believe it's true, maybe the best recruiting job that James Franklin has done in his Penn State career is finding a way to keep Katron Allen and Nick Singleton in State College, because either guy could have gone anywhere else that they wanted and been option 1A in the backfield. You look at the development of Drew Aller, what he could potentially be this year under a new OC, and you just wonder, is this finally the year that Penn State doesn't just win 10 games, doesn't just get to a quality bowl game, but actually finds a way to beat the Ohio States, to beat the toughest teams on their schedule?
And not having to face all of those teams in the regular season is certainly a huge boost to the chances for Penn State this year. I think the expectations for the folks in State College feel a little bit more muted this season than they did going into last year because of the fact that the offense wasn't as explosive. There weren't as many chunk plays for the Nittany Lions on offense as what a lot of folks anticipated. But you talk about the backfield with Singleton and Allen, the quarterback position with Aller, you add in wide receiver talent that's there now as well. There's a lot that goes around. So if you see a step forward, if you see enhanced development for Penn State, there's no reason to think they won't be in the thick of that conversation as well. It's one of the things that's intriguing about their opening game. I don't think West Virginia is going to be a national championship
No, but
contender.
I think that's a big barometer for the season.
Kind of like, going to Auburn on the road at Jordan-Hare Stadium in recent years and seeing what that game represented, them dominating, taking that game over in the second half. We've seen Penn State show the ability to do that, and it's going to be a hostile environment.
But you know what you don't see on that schedule? Yes, Ohio State's there. You don't see Michigan. You don't see Oregon on that schedule as well. Yes, you have to go to LA to face USC. But again, it is sometimes in this new look Big Ten about the rotation and the teams you don't play, and where you play the best teams. But for me, it comes down to Drew Aller. I think he is a young man who physically has every tool in the box, right? Yeah. You look at him, he can make every throw, his size. He is a pro-ready quarterback in every single area, except the fact that they really haven't let him throw the ball down the field. And part of that is because they haven't had the explosives on the outsides and the guys that can do it. But if they can just find that, Anthony, I think this guy has the ability to show off something that we haven't seen yet in his Penn State career.
And you wonder, in addition to just the schematics of it, does Andy Kotelnicki come in and infuse a little bit of, or maybe diminish the risk-averse nature
I think you have to.
That Drew Aller played with last season? It's great that he protected the football at a high level for a first-year starter, but there are times where you do need to be willing to take a risk. Give your playmakers opportunities, even in contested situations, to go up and get the football, to make a big-time grab. That wasn't necessarily something Drew Aller seemed as comfortable with last season. It served Penn State well. They led the Big Ten in rushing, led the Big Ten in scoring.
It was forever until he threw a pick.
Yeah, I mean, they had a good offense, but Penn State is judged by a different standard. We're comparing them with the best teams in America, the teams of national championship caliber. That's where sometimes you have to sort of calculate when that risk is necessary. And the confidence doesn't only have to come from his OC and the schematics of that offense, but knowing he's got a defense that's going to get it done at a really high level. Up front, at linebacker, on the back end.
Can you say Abdul Carter?
I mean, everywhere on the field.
He's the star, but everywhere on that defensive side.
Yes, I mean, Denai Dennis-Sutton is the next star on the opposite edge from them as well. The back end, this is kind of the golden age of secondary play in State College as well. They've never had a stretch this deep, this talented year over year with DBs going to the league, high draft picks. So that defense, even if the offense does have the occasional flub, will get them out of jeopardy time and time again.
So who knows, to paraphrase James Franklin, maybe 2024 is the year that Penn State goes from good to great to elite. It seems like yesterday, and yet it seems so long ago, Michigan was raising the championship trophy. J.J. McCarthy and company, of course, Jim Harbaugh, no longer there. Sharon Moore was a huge part of it. He is now the head coach of the Wolverines as they start the post-Jim Harbaugh era, also post-J.J. McCarthy and post-Blake Corum. Right. I could go on and on, yet the Wolverines are still getting a ton of respect. They are top 10 AP preseason. Rick Pizzo back with Anthony Herron. Are we to believe that this team, and it is a little bit, I hate to use the phrase rebuild, but in terms of a roster, I think it's closer to that than it is a reload, especially on the offensive side. Is this still a team that, if it plays to its potential, could make the college football playoff now that it's a 12-team field?
Yes, I believe so, but it's
There's
more...
a little bit of a but in the way that you said that.
Because it's more conjecture. There aren't as many proven commodities in Ann Arbor as we're accustomed to, as we've seen in recent years, where there were just so many seasons where they had multi-year starters at every position, the O-line,
and an offensive line that was so
quarterback.
good every year.
Right, and so every report that I'm hearing out of Ann Arbor, every beat writer I'm talking to is saying the O-line looks fantastic again this season. So no reason to think we won't see another Joe Moore Award-worthy offensive line in Ann Arbor this season. But it is different. We haven't seen those five guys take the field and dominate together yet. So it's a bit unproven. We haven't seen Donovan Edwards be the main rock toter for a full year. Yes, we've seen games and flashes and highlights. But as far as being the guy the program has to count on every single week, we haven't seen that yet. We have no idea who's going to start at quarterback and how that individual will perform behind center, whereas we've seen over two different QBs in the last 3 years, Big Ten championship play from that position. So there's just a lot that's unproven in Ann Arbor right now. So yes, there's no reason to doubt that the defending national champions would be in the mix, but there's a little bit of trepidation, a little bit of uncertainty for what that means.
Well, and I also think that last year that offense was such a proven commodity that they could rely on that even if they didn't have the best defensive performance, which they did. I'm not trying to say that wasn't the case. And I don't think, yes, they lost some important guys in the defense. I just think the way it's been built for the last 5-7 years, that defense is not going to miss much of a beat. And I think you played, obviously, on that D-line. Sometimes it's easier, it's more instinctual on the defensive side to just read and react and play. My concern does come on the offensive side. You mentioned Donovan Edwards. bursts, but has never been the guy, has always had kind of that added role, great pass catcher out of the backfield. I think Colston Loveland is arguably the best tight end in the country, but it's all those surrounding pieces that makes me wonder, can this offense do everything it needs against that schedule to be part of the 12?
One of the things I was talking about late last week, I was sitting here with Kylan Mills, and I was making the point that Colston Loveland could be the key cog in adding comfort to the quarterback position for a team in the Big Ten championship picture. And that's going to be really necessary regardless of who's behind center for the Wolverines. But then that defense, like you referenced as well, having Mason Graham up front, having Kenneth Grant there, so the interior of that D-line, extremely formidable. Will Johnson on the back end. They've got playmakers, but it's not across the board of proven commodities, even on the defensive side of the football. Wink Martindale comes in. It's been a while since he coached in college football, but we know he can coach defense at a high level, a very aggressive philosophy that he brings over there as well. So there's a lot to be confident in and comfortable. But even the schedule, early in the season, Michigan's schedule is not sort of this easy on-ramp like we've seen in recent years.
No, they had one of the easiest non-conference schedules in the country a year ago. They start with Fresno State and Texas. Is the second game, excuse me, of the year for the Wolverines. So you're going to know right away if this Michigan team is good to go. Let's talk about your alma mater, because I think Iowa may be the most fascinating team in the country this year. I'm not just saying in the conference. We know what the defense is going to bring you. Tim Lester comes in. How much different does the offense look? And the bigger question, and a question we didn't think we would be asking 2 weeks ago, who's going to be running the offense? Because a lot of on-site reports are that Brendan Sullivan, the former Northwestern QB, has looked much better than Cade McNamara, who is, of course, returning from a serious injury.
I was just talking to Scott Dochterman from The Athletic.
Yeah, we talked to them last week, too.
Yeah, I mean, he's as dialed into this program and college football in general as anyone. He's right now still under the impression Cade McNamara has the inside track on the starting QB position, but at least Brendan Sullivan is doing what Iowa was hopeful that he would be capable of doing. Look like a more than competent player if they need to make a move, if they needed to transition at QB. It's been 2 years since Cade McNamara has been able to maintain health during a season anyway.
It's a legitimate issue.
Right, and if for some reason Cade McNamara's performance warrants moving on, you have someone who's been able to do it at a high level in Big Ten play in Brendan Sullivan. And yes, he hasn't been a first-team All-Big Ten QB, but I've called games where Brendan Sullivan has lit up the opposing offense.
The best player on the field.
Exactly. So, I mean, you have that available, the quarterback position, more insulated in Iowa City than it's been in years. And they're a program that more than any other program in the country has proven to be QB-proof. So that's a great thing for them. If you get any more out of the quarterback, then Iowa is right there in the thick of the college football playoff convo.
Any more, if you get anything out of that quarterback last year, I mean, this team defensively was historically good. They just need to be, I mean, you give me average, you give Tim Lester and Phil Parker average this year at the quarterback position, slightly above average. I may be on board with what I think by you is a sleeper pick. Rutgers is also a sleeper pick. But it's funny because the Scarlet Knights have kind of become a trendy pick among college football insiders after being beaten down the last couple of years as they kind of started the year, or the second stint, I should say, under Greg Schiano. Now you have Kyle Monungai, who's finally getting the respect he deserves. You have a massive amount of returning production, veteran leadership. But much like Iowa, the question is, do they have a quarterback? And now it's Ethan Kaliakmanis, a former Minnesota Gopher, that can give them enough offensively that this team could threaten for the playoff. Because I love, and I mean love with a capital L, the schedule that the Scarlet Knights will play this year.
And Ethan Kaliakmanis is just the latest of what's been several quarterbacks in the coaching tenure of Kirk Ciarrocca at multiple institutions that have just played their best football with Kirk Ciarrocca as their OC.
And have struggled when he wasn't the OC.
Exactly, yeah. So it just shows how he enhances the comfort, the productivity of the certain quarterbacks that he's been able to work with at multiple spots. And so Rutgers fans hoping that Ethan Kaliakmanis is just the latest example of that, where he gets back to playing at an extremely high level because he's going to be with a program that's been building and with an OC that really knows his skill set, that he trusts at a really high level. And even back at Minnesota, I mean, we have both talked to PJ Fleck a bunch. They were really high on what Ethan Kaliakmanis was capable of. but it just never really came to fruition on a consistent basis. I was frankly surprised he was able to beat out Gavin Wimsatt so quickly for the quarterback position because the productivity between the two of them was really fairly similar last year. So it just shows Kyle McManus showed up, knew exactly what to do, how to do it, and did it at a high level for Schiano to make that decision.
And I know that Rutgers may have a great year, and people may say, well, it's the schedule. They only have one, I believe, opponent that is ranked in the preseason in the top 25 on their schedule. You don't play Ohio State, you don't play Michigan, you don't play Penn State, you don't play Oregon. I understand that. But if this team does what I think it's capable of doing, and I'll go on record by saying I think they could win 9 games this year. Yeah. I wouldn't be blown away if they play their best ball if they were able to get to double digits. I don't care who you play. If you get to 9 or 10 wins in this conference this year, you have done an amazing job coaching and playing football.
Greg Schiano's been talking for multiple seasons at this point that this is the season he feels like he's been building the program towards, this developmental program. And, programs like Rutgers and Iowa and Minnesota with so much talent that returns. I know in the transfer portal and NIL era, the conversation turns into just thinking that, the big boys come and pluck up the talent from everyone else. There are guys who return to Piscataway for this season and this opportunity. They seemed as dialed in and as focused as can be. And yes, we could certainly have a conversation about USC as well for the college football playoff possibilities. But I wanted to make sure we got Rutgers in because I didn't want to be sitting here in November with Rutgers having an amazing run and not be able to say, I told you so.
Well, and all those guys that came back, it's very similar to Michigan last year. A lot of those guys could have been gone, but they knew what they had and they came back feeling. Now, I'm not going to go on record right now and say Rutgers is going to win the national championship.
Rutgers is Michigan.
Like I did about Michigan a year ago, but there are some similarities to be made.